3, 2, 1. Excellent. It's amazing with technology these days. It used to be you just held a meeting and you brought people together, and now you have to have a video camera and you stream, and so you have all of the joys of putting together an in-person meeting as well as producing like a live TV show, which is something that I'm just not a producer of media content like that. I do have. I have a lavalier. Is it not? Is it? It's coming through the. Yeah, I think the mic is. I think the mic system is good. Are we good on the mic? Okay. Excellent. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO. Thank you all for coming. I think every one of you has participated in some of the virtual meetings. Has everyone participated in at least one? Has everyone, how many of you participated in all 4? All right, fantastic. Excellent. As I mentioned, we are live streaming this. I think we had about 75 RSVPs. So one of the kind of logistic details about today is we want this to be as much a conversation and an engaging conversation about these issues. But we also want to engage the people who aren't here in as much as possible. So we're going to do that in 2 different ways. First of all, we have 2 handheld mics. Nettie has one, and I have one, and we'll pass them around. If you have something to say, ideally, please say it into the mics, so that that the people who are listening on the live stream can hear that as well. Despite the sort of, if we weren't broadcasting, I think the acoustics in this room would be sufficient that everyone could hear you, but they're not going to be able to pick that up on the live stream.
So I'll be running around.
So we'll be running around with the mics. Another element of this is we're going to be doing 4 breakout session discussion tables. The way we're going to handle that as far as the live stream is concerned is we will focus the attention of the camera and the mics on one table. And we'll bounce the people around that table, so it won't always be the same people. But we do want to have at least one of the conversations broadcast out, and that's how we're going to handle it. There are, I believe, steering committee members at each of the tables, correct? If you're a steering committee member, raise your hands. Okay. I have a little preponderance over here at this table, but that's okay. What the steering committee members are going to do, ideally, is to work on, there's a Google Doc, and what we'd like to do is capture as much of the conversation and ideas as possible, but primarily focusing on actual action items or potential principles that we can walk out of the room with tomorrow. So over the course of the day, today and tomorrow, the steering committee members will kind of be recording, not necessarily the whole conversation, but at least parts of the conversation that could become principles. Further logistic details, because this is the best way to start a conversation. Start talking about logistics. The restrooms are in the back corner. We have lunch. If you haven't already had it, please help yourself. The plan is to we'll do a round of a roundtable conversation, a break, another round of roundtable conversation. Should bring us towards the end of the day. We have worked out kind of joint happy hour reception thing with the Library Freedom Project, who's also meeting today. It's at Zeitgeist, and the Library Freedom Project they're running a little later. Their program runs until, I think, 6:30. So they're meant to get there at 7. We won't be running that long, so we'll probably just go there early. Because that's how NISO works. It's like, hey, let's go to the... if you would like to join us, please let me know. It's a fairly large place. I don't think we, the 30 of us, 35 of us, are going to stress that establishment, I don't think. But if you want to come, please let me or Juliana know. We will try to find some way to get there, as maybe a bunch of Ubers or taxis. I think taxis are difficult to get here. We've had a couple meetings here at this location, so Uber might work a little better. But we will head over there when we're done. We'll start again tomorrow at, I think it's 8:30, Juliana? I think it's 8:30. Tomorrow will be a longer day. We'll have lunch. My goal is, since I'm headed off on vacation tomorrow afternoon as soon as we're done, my goal is not to push till 5:30 tomorrow. So ideally.
The schedule is breakfast 8:30, start at 8:30.
Yes.
And then the schedule says
the schedule's
5:30, but
yes, but we might push that a little bit. Finally, as I mentioned, the live stream, we're also recording everything. So if you feel like you don't want to be recorded saying anything, just keep that in mind. Any questions about the logistics before we get started? Excellent. Now, I think what we should do before we get started is, it would probably be, I was surprised at the number of people who had never actually met. So since this is going to be a lively, kind of interactive 2 days, I think we should start with a round of introductions. So I'm going to pass around the mic. If you could introduce yourself and your affiliation, and if you're a member of the steering committee, let people know.
Hi, I'm Eric Hellman. I'm part of the steering committee, and as of 4 days ago, I'm president of the Free eBook Foundation.
My name is Lori Ayer. I'm a consultant. I do RFID and materials handling consulting and work with open source systems and ILS procurements and a few other things. And I'm not a important person.
It's not a question of importance.
Hey, I'm Mike Robinson. I work as a systems librarian at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and I'm chair of the Privacy Committee of the Intellectual Freedom.
Andrew Pace from OCLC. Have product responsibility for management services, which includes patron management and identity management.
My name is Peter Murray, and I have 2 days left in my employment at Lyrasis, and then I will be out in the wild looking for open source and, well, no, I don't want to turn this into an advertisement for myself, so we'll just end it there.
My name is Galen Charlton. I'm with Equinox Software, and my day-to-day responsibilities include running their COA and Evergreen hosting platforms.
Christopher Harris, I'm the director of the School Library System with the Genesee Valley Educational Partnership, a regional services agency in Western New York, serving 22 districts, a small rural area, about 20,000 students. I also work with the Office for Information Technology Policy at the ALA Washington office. I'm a fellow with them for youth and technology policy issues.
Hi, I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information.
I'm Nettie Legassi. I'm the Associate Director for Programs at NISO.
I'm Lisa Hinchliff, the Coordinator for Information Literacy Services and Instruction and Coordinator for Strategic Planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and member of the steering committee.
I'm Bonnie T. Rena. I'm a member of the steering committee and I'm a fellow at Data and Society where I work on kind of privacy literacy on the libraries, on the public library side, and information ethics with computer science researchers on the academic library side.
Hey everyone, I'm Eric Frierson, Senior Discovery Services Engineer with EBSCO.
Marshall Breeding, consultant in various aspects of library technology, and I'm on the steering committee.
I'm Dan Ayala. I'm the Director of Information Security and Privacy at ProQuest. I don't have a long library history, but I come out of a long history of privacy.
Hi, I'm Abigail Wicks. I do data analysis for Oxford University Press.
I'm Rich Entlick. I do collection analysis at Cornell University, and I discovered that the municipal buses don't come anywhere near this place, which explains my late arrival.
I'm Bobby Newman, and I'm probably most famous to my fellow librarians for being librarian by day. I'm also a PhD student and a consultant and speaker, and I'm very interested in the intersection of policy, technology, digital literacy, class, socioeconomic status, and behavior. So that's what I focus.
I'm Shlomo Sanders. I'm the CTO of Ex Libris, and I've been working on security and privacy in Ex Libris for the last 8 or 9 years.
Hi, I'm Mike Taylor. I work at Elsevier. I work in the area of metrics and analytics. And I first got involved in this issue when I was working with the ORCID project.
Hi, I'm Michael Altman. I am Director of Research and Head of a Program on Information Science at the MIT Libraries and Senior Fellow at Brookings. And I do privacy research and security practice, among other things.
Hello, I'm Michael Zimmer. I'm on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I do a lot of research on privacy online, including library privacy, and worked and consulted with the Office of Intellectual Freedom on their privacy initiatives, and I'm on the steering committee as well.
Is it on now? Okay, I'm gonna start singing. I'm Juliana Wood. I'm the Educational Programs Manager with NISO. If you need anything, let me know.
And if you're, sorry. There we go. If you're participating virtually, we are using the hashtag NISOPrivacy for any of you on Twitter. We thought that that might be one of the easiest ways to get feedback from people who are not here in the room. You can also email us if you have some specific thoughts or comments. Probably Juliana or Nettie are the best people to email if you have any content, anything you'd like to add. So again, that's #NISOPrivacy. And if you would, if you're in the virtual world, shout out and wave virtually and let us know who you are and that you're participating. So. Since almost all of you, or a good chunk of you, have already have participated in the virtual conferences, I'm not going to go through the same presentation that I've done 4 times. But I do want to highlight a few of the things that I did mention in those talks. The first is this, the ALA Code of Ethics. I think this is a fantastic place for us to start, at least thinking about some of these issues. And I raise this because a few people who have talked to me about this project have expressed some concern that we are, trying to encourage, not necessarily encourage, some people have expressed a concern that we're kind of opening the door and moving away from this core principle that the library community has about privacy. And I want to stress that that's not the case. What we're trying to do is find a nuanced way, a balanced way to adhere to these principles, acknowledge that these principles exist, but also acknowledge that our environment is changing slightly with the interoperability between systems and the exchange of information between systems, that we should start this conversation with this as a base and reflect on it, but reflect on it in a way that we also have to have systems that function. And part of how these systems function is to engage and track behavior as people are moving through the systems. Some of the library systems can't function without some of this tracking behavior. Now, how can we acknowledge that and kind of work together to address this kind of tension that exists between the digital systems that are tracking behavior and the core principles that we have? And also acknowledging this statement that I've made several times, that the publishers and the vendors that serve our community aren't necessarily librarians, and they do have different perspectives on these issues, and we need to acknowledge those differences. Because as I think it was during the session on publisher systems, when talking with the librarians, a number of people on the call said the librarians don't perceive themselves as competing with the likes of Amazon and Google. But the vendors and the publishers, they do. And they do feel disadvantaged if they have to operate in a system where of absolute protection of patron privacy, so therefore you can't build in the same sort of search functionalities that the likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook and those kind of companies do. So can we as a group address this tension? Build systems that enhance services that patrons value, that simultaneously protects patron privacy. And what NISO is doing here, and I mentioned this, I think, in the LIDA Privacy Technology Group meeting on Saturday, I think it was. How this project and how NISO operates is different from how ALA operates, and ARL and other library organizations, how they operate. In that what we're trying to do and the role that NISO serves in the community is one of consensus, of bringing together the publishers and the vendors and the librarians to come to an agreed solution to some of these issues. Now, is that going to necessarily solve everyone's problems? Probably not. Are there gaps in a consensus process? Are there compromises that need to be made? Absolutely. But I think, or at least it's NISO's role to foster these conversations, to foster the development of consensus between the different parties in an attempt to find a common solution. Because as ALA as an advocate, ALA has many different aspects to it. But ALA can approach some of these issues and develop what principles, and then bring those principles out to the vendor community and say, well, we're going to write these things into our contracts. That's one way to approach some of these issues. That makes life increasingly challenging. It kind of relegates a lot of these conversations to negotiations between lawyers, which gets very problematic and very expensive very quickly. A couple things that have come out. I attended several, actually, I think, the sessions where I was not speaking, the only sessions that I attended at ALA this year were about privacy, interestingly enough. And one of the sessions highlighted this notion that privacy in this space, probably the solution that we will kind of head closest towards, is a solution that provides patrons choices, opportunities, understanding, in a way that builds trust. Because actually that's one of the key elements of this entire conversation. How can we build trust into these systems? Another thing that came out of these conversations that we've had is the difference here between not all privacy issues are related to hacks. Not all issues here, not all breaches are necessarily malicious. Like I like to think of what happened with Adobe is not necessarily malicious. It was just probably not, it's kind of bad programming practice. Like, it's not that they couldn't do it. It's that their minds were maybe focused on other things. And not all data sharing is inappropriate. We need to constrain that data sharing and understand that it's happening. Acknowledge to the community that these things are happening. Or let people choose to opt out and give people an opportunity to understand what's going on with regard to data sharing. When is it appropriate and when is it not? I think Eric has been talking a lot about this, and Gary Price has been talking about a lot about this. Some of these issues about data sharing. I mean, this is a screenshot from Google Analytics. I'm surprised at how many libraries have implemented Google Analytics in their systems with not a lot of understanding about all of the data that's being shared. I think another issue related to this is the data sharing that happens between Overdrive and Amazon when you're lending books out of on your Kindles. Again, how much of this data is necessary to fulfill those services? And what are the relationships that are governed? Like, how do we govern those relationships? How do we acknowledge those relationships that data sharing is taking place? How do we limit it in some ways? And again, Adobe, same issue. Are there ways in which we could build in security into our processes and our procedures so that inappropriate sharing is handled and addressed? Micah, one of the things I really enjoyed about your presentation, maybe we should have made it one of the first ones, was the definitions that you pulled up. Because I think reflecting on these definitions is really important about the differences and differences that exist between different perspectives on some of these issues. The differences between necessarily privacy, confidentiality, personally identifiable information, and sensitive information. Data breaches versus data security. Again, these are important to consider in the light of this conversation. And I think, Micah, you also made the point that you need to balance these issues between how much security you're going to build into your system and at what cost. Because at the end of the day, a lot of a lot of these issues are going to be addressed by vendors who are concerned about the costs of these. And the library community doesn't necessarily have a lot of extra resources to spend on these systems. And we could maybe lock a lot of these data down, but at what cost? So again, I would like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for pushing this project forward, for funding it, and for supporting NISO's work in this area. What we're going to do today and tomorrow is a virtual unconference kind of discussion built around the 4 virtual conversations that we've already had. And I'm glad that so many of you have participated in all 4. A couple of years ago, in I think it was 2011 or 12, I participated in the Beyond the PDF conference. And I was one of 3 people who was involved, 3 or 4 people who was involved in drafting the Amsterdam Manifesto on data citation. This is not exactly what we want to do here. I don't think NISO necessarily wants to create a manifesto on privacy. But this is a great example of what I think I'd like this project to achieve. Develop a core set of principles that we can then agree on over the course of the next 2 days. And then subsequent to the development of those principles, work to flesh them out in the same way that we took the Amsterdam Manifesto on data citation, worked with the Research Data Alliance and DataCite and Force 11, and I can't remember how many other organizations were involved in that joint working group, to flesh those principles out. I think we even dropped 1 or 2 and merged some of them, maybe developed some others, but craft some very specific language and then build around those principles what we can do next. How can we build this into business processes? How can maybe NISO develop some of those principles into recommended practice? Or how can we implement some of those principles? What can vendors do or libraries do to actually make those things work? So I kind of want to use that process as a model for what NISO is going to do here with privacy. So where do we want to be at the end of this process? The goal of what we'd like to do here is to develop a consensus framework of principles that prescribe how information systems work to respect privacy of patron data. Consensus. I talked a little bit about consensus. This is what distinguishes NISO and what will distinguish this project. We've got many of the systems vendors who are developing these systems participating in this project. We've got many publishers and librarians participating in this project, and everyone's bringing their own different perspectives. I hope that through the next 2 days, we can air some of these issues and talk about some of these issues. And consensus doesn't necessarily mean that we agree on everything. One of the goals of this project is also to highlight areas where maybe we don't agree, and just highlight them, and acknowledge that there is disagreement about some of these issues. We don't necessarily have to cover every single aspect of this in the principles, but we can say, well, there are these issues, we acknowledge that those issues exist, and we have to deal with them in a different fashion. These, as I said, I'm looking forward to the outcome of this project to be a very high-level framework, not necessarily actual implementations or things that necessarily specific projects that need to happen or specific actions that different parties need to take. We can develop those later. I'm realistic about what we can really accomplish in the course of 12 hours. 4 hours today and 8 hours tomorrow. But how can we advance these principles and how can we come to some agreement on these things? I want to prescribe behavior here. I would like not to get to the point of demanding things between different parties. I'm sure we will, there are forums where, contractual language or things along those lines get developed. I'd like that this effort not come out with that at the end. I want to think broadly here about the information systems that we're talking about and the implications for those information systems. So not just, not just a particular discovery service or a particular publisher system. I want to think broadly about these things. However, I do want to acknowledge that we are not going to be working on, say, a new new security hashes for securing information, new protocols. I'd like to point to those things that already exist. There's a lot of backbone internet work that takes place on security, and we don't necessarily want to step into those spaces. I want to, again, another thing I want to highlight here is the respect of privacy. This is, as I mentioned at the start, this is a core principle of the library community, a core principle of the companies that serve the library community. And I want to say respect, but not necessarily be ardent in the addressing privacy, that there is room for nuance here. And you can respect privacy while still using some of this data. And how can we navigate that maybe minefield? And then finally, reflect on here, patrons, that this is really about the people who are using these systems. And my background is in marketing, and you always have to respect the needs of the customer. And so keeping that in mind, keeping the end goal of keeping the patron in mind here in these discussions, I think is really important. So, for those of you in the room, there were copies of the latest issue of Information Standards Quarterly. It's actually not the full issue. It's an extract of a few the feature articles that are included in there. Please take a look. This was a special issue edited by Gary Price. There was also an issue of the latest issue of Computers in Libraries, which I wrote an article about this project. That was the lead article in this issue. So if you, I think Computers in Libraries has posted this article up for free. So it is available for free as part of that issue. I know not all of the content is available, but I know this one is. So, some questions. These are a few questions that came out of the steering committee that I want to highlight and kind of think about as we start to get digging into some of these issues. What's the most important thing that we could do with regard to improving these situations, these issues, the issues of privacy, as it relates to the four different themes? What would make a difference? I mean, we can all think of a dozen potential ideas about privacy and its implications for library or vendor systems. But what would actually make a difference? A meaningful difference in addressing some of these questions? Another issue, and this came up in a conversation about the patron participation here and the opt-in. Like, it doesn't really help anyone to have a checkbox buried in a library website that no one is aware of. So how can we build awareness in the community about these issues and these principles to get buy-in and, if necessary, assent from the patron community who we're offering these options to? Another issue that came up in the initial conversations with regard to the steering committee was how can we get these things applied? Once we've developed these principles, what can we do to make sure that they get adopted? When I did an update session about this project, one of the attendees asked this question, like, how do we get the vendors to actually adopt these, build these principles into their services? So that's another issue that I think we should consider and think about when it comes to the principles and the discussions that we're going to have in the next 2 days. How can we make these things happen? So, let's get started. This is the agenda. I know you can't read it. It's going to be a fully packed 2 days. Zooming in a little bit, I kind of deleted out the replication of the detail about what we're going to do. We have the 4 virtual meetings. I'd like to we've broken up the agenda into those 4 topics. We'll have a summary conversation, or at least a conversation about that session. What did people think? What were some takeaways? Did anyone have any kind of highlights out of that session? We'll do that for a couple minutes. Then we'll break up into round tables. I think we've conveniently numbered the number of tables and attendees so that we'll have 5 or 6 people per table. And again, we'll have one of the tables streamed and we'll rotate people around because I think I think there's opportunity to intermingle and intermix during these conversations. We'll talk for about 45 minutes. The steering committee members will take down notes and extract, if possible, principles from those conversations. Then we'll have a kind of reporting out session, and then we'll have a group conversation about those issues. And then we will wash, rinse, and repeat 3 times. We will, I hope, get through the library systems and the publisher systems this afternoon, so 2 hours each. We will hopefully leave around 5:30. Tomorrow we'll start again. The morning will be spent doing the same with vendor system, provider systems, intermediary systems, and then the legal frameworks conversation. And then tomorrow afternoon, we will spend the day honing in on those principles. What can we agree on? What is problematic? And hopefully we'll wrap it up with a principles document that we can all celebrate. Any questions? Yes, Eric. And reminder, thank you, Eric, for grabbing the mic, but when you're speaking,
Raise your hand.
raise your hand and push that. Is it green? Yeah, there we go.
Hi. So several times here in the formulation of our goal, you've used the phrase privacy of patron data. And I'm worried about that because I don't think the thing that we should be worried about is privacy of the patrons. And I worry that if we focus on privacy of patron data, then the legalists of us will say, oh, this is library data, it's not patron data. Or this is publisher data, this is not patron data. And I don't want to be in a position where we recommend something for patron data that if someone considers what they do to be, not patron data, then they get around.
Yeah.
Anyway,
No.
that's my concern.
That's a fair point. Any reactions or thoughts on that? Why don't you just leave? I mean,
Okay, yeah, this reminds me of something I'd seen in some draft principles that the Privacy Subcommittee of AOA's IFC put together. And one of the focuses in their document, particularly as it applied to libraries making contractual arrangements with vendors, was the point that libraries own their data, and therefore the vendors have to take necessary steps to protect it. And that's something that, while I see the necessity of that phrasing in certain contexts, because if you need something to potentially litigate against, referencing an abstract, protecting a patron's degree of privacy may not be actionable. But I agree with Eric that in the broader area, we should not focus too much on data, because there are certainly aspects of patron privacy that go beyond what actually gets recorded. I guess my question would be, would we be going too far out of scope for any framework we develop here?
So, Eric, just to clarify on your comment or your question, is it that individual data elements are too narrow, or that taking one element out of context may not violate privacy, but the collection of them would? Could we do this the way we've done in personal identifiable information in other countries and say that this element isn't private on its own, but the conceptual notion of these things together, short of going to the whole patron and saying this collection of things makes up a private element? Yes, it'll have data elements underneath it.
Names are always tricky, and it may be impossible to compress all of the concepts into the name, but I might refer to one of the more modern definitions of confidentiality that reviewed in earlier sessions, and one that my research colleagues are using, which is what can be learned about individuals by virtue of their participation in a particular activity or data source. So rather than saying, this is private or not, it's what do you learn about me or the things that I did because I interacted with this system at this point, and how do we make sure that that's regulated in some way.
Does that capture your... Sorry. Do you want to...
As someone who helped work on the one that triggered the discussion about PII being maybe too narrow, I mean, I do agree we want to focus larger on the idea of maybe we don't want to lose stuff that we should be protecting by being too legalistic in the definitions. But at the end of the day, and I think we need to get the spirit behind what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, down the road, contracts and agreements will hinge on legalistic things. And so I think it's important for the vendor community to get an idea of the level of our commitment to trying to protect that reader behavior. And we're always going to kind of get in the weeds a little bit when particular services or contracts are implemented.
So Andrew, I'm going to agree with Eric, and well, 2 points. One, vendor and service provider and librarian are not mutually exclusive, so I'd like people to remember that. Also, I think Eric's point, if I can put words in his mouth, is the ALA Code of Ethics predated library automation. So we started with the Library Code of Ethics as our starting point. And so I think keeping that in mind, and not narrowing it down to data elements, but that patron privacy is part of the code of ethics of the profession we are all serving, and keeping that in mind.
I just wanted to say that sometimes taking particular data items and assigning them to be private or non-private is kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at things now that we can tie together data and huge collections of data and make inferences about people and about groups. And I think that groups have privacy concerns as well as individuals. And private libraries need to be cognizant of the privacy rights of groups as well as the privacy rights of individuals.
I hadn't thought about what you said before about the privacy rights of groups, because that's kind of how libraries deal with privacy, is by anonymizing the personal into some profile that is a group. So that kind of leaves kind of fewer options if we have to say, well, in aggregate, professors in chemistry searched a lot for carbon or something like that. So, or nuclear secrets or whatever. So by saying that groups are entitled to privacy, it's kind of a big deal.
Marcia, can you?
So I think the only session on privacy Todd didn't attend at ALA was the session that Andrew and Asher and I did on Saturday, which is completely fine. He came the last time at CNI. But we had very similar discussions that I saw from the tweets from some of the other sessions. But I think one of the things that we actually played around a little bit with in our session that is kind of coming up for me already in this conversation today is whether or not it's actually possible to have anonymized data anymore. Or if any attempts that we are talking about for anonymity is actually created anonymity, and whether it's, because we've seen anonymous data sets released many, many times, and how quickly they turn out not to be anonymous because of the re-identification algorithms that people can apply to them. And I don't mean that in sort of like a science fiction, there will never ever be any more privacy, but in that question of, if we start from the standpoint that maybe there isn't anonymous data, we're actually at a point of saying, how much do we do to try and make it as anonymous as possible, as opposed to assuming it starts anonymous and then it's a question of collecting identification. I don't really have an answer so much as this was a thought-provoking framing that came up in that discussion.
So Doug gave the initial overview on anonymity and these virtual talks and things like that. And I think there's a realization that the concepts that we have of de-identification are more limited in a big data world where there's all sorts of ancillary information that can be used to match people, and where there are more techniques to link things. I think in talking about this, it's very important to think about what the threat model is, to be taking up what are you expecting, what harm are you expecting, and how does that harm manifest? Some of these techniques, if you're reducing, the average number of people who are going to be discovered and the information you're going to find out about them, those anonymization isn't necessarily broken. It's still helpful. If you're trying to guarantee that looking at sort of
quote, anonymized data. Nobody is linked and you learn nothing bad about them or even nothing severely bad. That's increasingly hard to do. And part of the reaction to that, at least in some of the research and policy spaces, just that we need to look beyond data collection and data restriction on data collection to regulation on data use and to giving people downstream from whom the data was collected some ability to see how their data is used, to audit it, to correct it. Things like the fair information practices, the OECD principles, go beyond what you collect to how it's used and how you can interact with it later.
Well, I think this is interesting because now we're starting to talk about aggregations of data, and data as it exists now in the silos that it exists in, what is searched in the OPAC, what is searched in a discovery layer, what is searched in a specific ANI database, what somebody does at Google Scholar, just by the fact that it's spread out over all of those systems limits the ability for one person or one entity to have that overall view of what that patron is doing. And when we start to talk about big data and the aggregation of all of that activity data for the patron, we're gaining more data points that we can use to then identify that person. And maybe that's a focus that we should be having on I like that idea about, the collection is going to happen, the aggregation we may not be able to prevent, but what is the standards or what is the principles of how we use that aggregated data where we can make some headway.
Every transaction has basically two sides. There is the individual, and then there is what they were searching for, what they were reading, what they were downloading, etc. And anonymization can be applied to both sides of the transaction in ways that are protective of patron privacy. And in some sense, it might be useful to think about scenarios where, regardless of whether the attempt to anonymize the patron is successful, if there has been careful enough work done on the other side of the transaction, it won't really matter because what's revealed is not sufficiently granular to be of any use to anybody, to be of any risk or threat to anybody. So I think we should be thinking in terms of the issue of surrogates, that yes, we have demographic surrogates that we can use for patrons. And generally, I would advocate for limiting those to academic groups rather than personally identifiable groups like gender, personal characteristics like gender, race, even though it might be useful in some situations to have that information, that it's a bit too risky in many respects, but surrogates for the bibliographic side, so not the specific title of the book or the journal article, but something that pulls back from it, converts it into a general subject area, maybe the language, in terms of circulating books in a library system, the particular branch library that it came from, things that carry little danger but still are important from the perspective of the information they provide to the library about who's doing what, who's using what, and you haven't lost all of the value in it. So.
But you do lose a lot of value if you're using this information to help inform relevancy and what books and titles are the most interest, to be able to only know that at a kind of category surrogate level, really kind of impairs the ability for relevancy engines to use that data in an effective way. So that's a trade-off. Maybe that's a necessary trade-off, but it's very valuable data.
I think it's also important that we consider the use of data and privacy implications for libraries of all types. And while it's great to hear from multinational vendors and prominent university library types, the majority of libraries in this country are small public and school libraries with often a single certified librarian, if they're lucky enough to have one of those. And that when we're talking about limiting to subject headings, most of my school libraries have a subject heading maybe for science, not 37 different branches of chemistry. And so there are different levels. I think that, if these principles are going to be at all useful across the broad spectrum of librarianship and all the different types of libraries, they do need to be respectful of those differences and the need to live in that broad, research-based, big information sphere, but also consider the implications in smaller areas.
So I'm going to take a somewhat more cynical view of this and suggest that probably the most fundamental principle here is one of transparency. There is a charming, quaint assumption in a lot of the discussion here that the information systems behave as they're supposed to, that confidential information stays confidential. That's not going so well out there. Whether it's government, education, industry. So it seems to me that the first place to begin is just with some clarity about who's collecting what information and how long they're keeping it. That is an absolute, basic point of departure for everything. Going from there, one can talk about the conditions under which it's shared and aggregated, but I'm not even sure we're doing a very good job of that fundamental transparency.
Yeah, and sorry, this is Laura Coulter. So just picking up on, I guess, what Cliff said and Eric and a couple of other people, I think we can meet a lot of these needs of dealing with multiple different kinds of libraries and the need to actually use data if we actually maintain these questions around like the ultimate question of patrons' access to the data and the information that's being maintained. So it's the transparency in knowing what's being collected, but also the access in terms of correcting it and deleting it, and then to accommodate these concerns about networked data, which is honestly where we really have to be looking at, because it is the case that we don't have anything that is purely anonymous or purely pure, and no piece of data is viewable in isolation anymore. So to accommodate those kinds of things, I think what we need to be looking at is questions ultimately about how the data is transferred and what violates the principle, what does or does not violate the principle of least surprise, keeping people informed in that way of how their data is being used, so that if they think that a system is a library system and they think the data is doing this, for it to be passing off to vendors and then vendors doing other things with it, that's going to be the kind of thing that we want to look at very carefully. So, and that's my main concern, because we can pass clear principles about how we individually handle data, but the networked data, I think, is the real challenge. And I thank you for the transparency point, and several of you. Thank you.
Briefly, I agree with the transparency point. I would note that in some of the, one way of analyzing it is thinking about the life cycle of the data, and that there are various stages like collection, retention, transformation, distribution, auditing, and various interventions or controls one can apply. Transparency is one of those controls. Limitation is another. Right? So you can apply transparency to all of these different phases, not just collection.
You can't be transparent if you don't even know if you have not enough information to be transparent. And I think that's where we are right now. As a librarian, it disturbs me that we are in a position to share with our users the licensing terms for the use of the materials. We have that from all of the vendors, and we've loaded it all into a database, and it says you can't copy more than X number of pages or whatever, but we can't tell them anything about what is happening to their transaction data because we don't know. In most cases, we're talking about licensed e-resources that are IP authenticated on vendor systems, and all that data is being collected by the vendor, and we have no agreements in place regarding what is considered acceptable use of that data, who it's shared with, how long it's retained, whether it's sold. So I would think it would be a tremendous step forward if we came out of this meeting even agreeing on some basic principles about vendors being transparent with libraries about what they're currently doing with the data, and then we can start talking about putting it into license and contract terms.
So I would agree with that on both the transparency and the disclosure, I think is the maybe term that we're talking about here. But I guess I want to, at least from my perspective as a librarian, say my experience talking to our vendors about this is that maybe not complete disclosure, but with more than one vendor, initiating a conversation has actually resulted in quite a bit of sharing about what they're doing with the data and what they're tracking. So I think perhaps part of this is just about opening up standard ways of having the conversation, because probably Eric doesn't want every vendor or every client asking individually. So are there some things that we can start to understand that when we say this kind of thing, it means this, and we can just know that that's happening. So we start to have a common vocabulary around what is being tracked, how is it being tracked. But I do think, I guess I've felt some discomfort when I'm in some conversations with librarians, this sort of, maybe they've tried and not had the good luck that I've had, but at least I want to share that I've had actually really positive experiences asking about this, and have had more than one vendor open up their analytics platform and demonstrate it and show me exactly what's there. Now that's not disclosure to the patron, obviously, but it's a greater level of transparency or openness that I sometimes feel our conversations are acknowledging. And again, I speak from my own experience, so if other people have different experiences, that's an important part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I agree with transparency. I think the problem is we don't want to get in a situation where you have to be of a certain level of knowledge and know the right person in the organization in order to get an answer to that question, and then not really be sure if they even know the full situation. I mean, I worked at a newspaper library. Our online archives was sold by the parent company and we weren't even told. I mean, that's not patron data, but in a corporate environment, absent policy in a corporate environment, things can be being done inside with the data that one part of the corporation doesn't know from the other. So.
And that just follows up, I think, on something that was mentioned earlier about ways to notify patrons that are actually not sort of buried in legal language. And what I think, oftentimes when I see notices of, oh, this company has been bought by this company, it's like just like a quick mailer and the letter, you're going to toss it out with all your other junk mail, and maybe in terms of developing standards, some kind of standard, privacy alert that comes along. We hold data, and now it's being transitioned to this other thing, and in a way that files it in and keeps it along with other privacy information. So, I mean, that would be a useful standard sort of way of communicating that would get the right information in the right hands instead of just kind of a, I don't know, boring mailer with tiny print about acquisitions.
But let's not do this in the way that the HIPAA security policies were done, and we acknowledge them at each doctor, and we don't even read them. I think there's there needs to be a better way of doing the informing than that, iconography or something. Yeah.
I think there would be broad consensus, is my guess.
I think that was a very lively exchange about goals and you know, where we're headed. And I think I've noticed that there's some people who've been, members of the steering committee have been kind of adding away to the document, capturing some of these ideas. We're just a little bit behind schedule, but that's okay.
I had one more question about the slide.
Sure.
So,
Go ahead.
one of the slides you walked us through, which was really good, it had the word proscribe in it.
Yeah.
And technically, to me, proscribe means what you don't do with patron data. And I'm not against that approach, but I'm wondering if describe is a more appropriate approach.
Sure.
Or was it just a loose use?
Just a loose use of the word.
Okay. Just want to know what our approach is going to be.
Despite the fact that I spent 10 minutes talking about one sentence, yeah, we can be very flexible about the outcomes. And in the same way about, take Eric's point about, data, patron privacy, the patron's data, we can come up with whatever principles we agree to. They can be prescriptions or descriptions. My point was simply that what we're trying to achieve is a kind of higher level principles rather than, this is how it should be handled in these situations. You could think of a principle that is, we should secure information exchanged on the network should be encrypted in some fashion, rather than saying it should be HTTPS specifically, or there's a variety of different ways that you could do that. And that's my point is I'd like the principles to be flexible enough, because the use cases and the implications are very heterogeneous.
And you'd like the principles to outlive very rapid changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, the principle of privacy dates back to the 20s, long before we were using computer systems. I'd like to think that we can continue to use these principles in a networked environment, because I don't think we're going to move away from a networked environment. So that's fair point. Any other questions, comments about the scope? Do you have a mic? Where's the mic?
Just for clarity's sake, I think the word you're looking for was prescribe, which means to dictate, as opposed to proscribe, which means to forbid.
I didn't run it through an editor. Unfortunately, this is what happens when Cynthia Hodgson retires. All right, so where is this?
Today's notes?
No. I mean, these are today's notes, and the fact that this is at the bottom of today's notes makes it keep moving. One of the joys of using Google Docs. So the first theme that we're going to talk about is internal library systems. This came out of the first, and since this is an unconference, we could do this in any different way. I put up the four themes in chronological order based on how we organized those meetings. The way we organized those meetings was basically by polling people and saying, when can you participate? A couple people mentioned that they wished that we had started with the legal frameworks first. So I'm going to throw this out and say, just because we did it chronologically, just because we started with library systems as the first webinar, doesn't mean that that's how we have to start this conversation today. Do you all have any preference about how we, which ones we do first, and how we go through the four themes? Any preference? The green light's on.
I'm going to speak up since I'm the person I think who talked about that.
I think it's not on now.
No?
Is it green?
Yes, now it is green.
Okay.
Yeah, I wish we would start with the legal framework. I felt like that last conversation, which was our fourth call, and I was on the phone for all of them, talked a lot more about how it ought to be, whereas the previous three were sort of, this is how it is. And I feel like it's very important in this room today that we talk about how we take a normative stance and look at how it ought to be.
It also strikes me that if we start with those legal frameworks, that we can then apply them to the specific use cases. So if there are overarching principles for our overarching principles, we'll come to them first and then apply them to systems the library runs, systems that are run by vendors, and systems that come from publishers.
I just wanted to point out that the legal framework does drift into principles or ethics, but the legal framework actually describes how things are as well. Not necessarily.
Well, yeah.
You know, I mean, so I'm not against, sorry, the only other thing I might mention, I wouldn't normally call someone out, but Deborah Caldwell-Stone, who works in OIF, who's trained as a lawyer in privacy issues, she can't be here till later today. So I don't know if we need that level of participation or if we have plenty of other, if that's desirable or a factor to consider.
Yeah.
So.
And
And as a lawyer with privacy degrees, I also like having other lawyers with privacy degrees.
Two people can say that.
So, yeah.
So we can watch two lawyers disagree.
And what was his name? Who was on the panel, the fracking? Was anyone in the room when they were the session? Who was the? No, he's a consultant.
Carson?
Yeah.
Carson Blackford?
I thought it was McDonald. He's in San Francisco. Anyway, he's going to be here tomorrow.
Well, then I can see. I didn't realize Deborah was coming, so yeah.
I agree in general, but
yeah, I think it's great that she's here. I didn't realize she'd be here later.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with Bobby about wanting to start about talking about how things should be rather than how they are, because one, talking about how they are is kind of depressing. And talking about how they should be can be uplifting. And I think that would be a good way to start, whether, I mean, not necessarily in the legal stuff, but overall.
Maybe we just split the difference.
Okay. Well, maybe we can have a conversation about how we'd like things to be from a broad perspective, not specifically about library systems. It's one of the joys of an unconference. We have an agenda, we can throw it out. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I guess one thing, setting aside the question of whether or not we have a discussion about the legal, and I mean, I think the legal framework is useful, but to my mind, it's only one of the possible frameworks, and maybe this gets back to what Bobby was saying about, the normative and the ideal. Because, the fair information principles that I talked about, have been encoded in various legal regimes, but they're not legal per se. They're a framework, and Bobby had gathered up many useful resources of the conceptual privacy work of Helen Nissenbaum. I mean, I think, to my mind, I don't care about whether we have the legal stuff tomorrow or today or in what order we do it, but it might be helpful to just hit on, like, in terms of the frameworks and the things that we found useful. I mean, we are information people, we were no doubt busily reading over the last couple of months. I'm curious, what were the frameworks that people thought most useful and helpful in formulating their thinking? Christopher did a chart that I thought, was useful to many of us. Bobby had gathered up many resources, so I would be curious about the frameworks. I don't know if that throws the agenda out of whack, or maybe that's a positive, but I would just put that out there. I find fair information principles useful, but maybe other people find other models better.
I have no, I don't necessarily care how we proceed through the days, as much as how we simply cover these different areas and look at these different questions, ensuring that we, in developing the principles, have touched on each of these areas. Because if we look at these questions strictly from a library perspective, that doesn't capture all of the landscape. So we could start from, there are circulating a number of kind of principles or frameworks. We could start a conversation there based on those. Do you want to have that kind of high-level conversation first about what we would like to see, what would be a good vision, and extrapolate from there based on some of the existing, the draft principles that IFC is working towards, and Eric is working on, and a few others. Lisa, you have just one.
I think one of the questions I have, and maybe this is kind of the same thing you just asked, Todd, in a slightly different way, is it seems to me when we say, well, what should be, I'm pretty confident from the blog posts and the conversations that we don't in this room all agree on even what should be. So I think that actually is one of our challenges as we've explored some of these other topics, which is as we try and say, well, how should we work in this area? We keep it always looks like we're having a disagreement around, the particulars of ABC, but that disagreement actually is sitting back in different conceptions of what should be. And so I'm not exactly sure how we could work through a process that says, that doesn't start by saying, well, what can we all agree on that should be, but what are even the conceptions in this room of what should be? Not saying that we want to say, okay, so I'd say A and you say B, and so we can get into a fight about it, but rather so we can actually appreciate that all of us care deeply about this issue. We're spending a lot of time on it, but we actually currently believe different things, and maybe having the multiplicity of beliefs out would sort of be a step towards sort of saying, well, what can we find consensus in this?
I think that's an excellent way to start, I'd like to throw out a little bomb. Now, what I'm about to suggest isn't a position I hold strongly or absolutely, but what I would like to suggest as one mode is that it should be possible with our digital services to allow patrons to conduct their use of library resources and resources provided through the library completely anonymously, in the sense that, as far as possible, no PII is retained or collected whatsoever at any point during the process, and that to the best of our ability, that protocols and cryptography be used to make it possible for zero knowledge transactions to take place. So just to give a concrete example of what I mean, it should be possible for an ebook vendor to receive a request to give a patron access to an ebook. I'm putting DRM to the side, although perhaps I shouldn't. But without either the content provider or the library having knowledge of who the patron is, what resource was requested, so that even if, say, there was a subpoena to all of the relevant logs held by the library and the vendor, it would not be possible, or at least feasible, to figure out, to tie, information received to the patron who requested it. So I'm just throwing that out there as a kind of one extreme.
Okay, and then at the other end of the other extreme, you have the institution who wants to track student success. And there's absolutely no way of tracking student success without knowing who the student is. So that's the complete other side of the spectrum, and there are many who require that. And they don't even give the student the ability to say they don't want that. It's just part of the institution, it's a requirement, and that's what there is. So it's, and I'm just saying, and then take the vendors. Vendors, I hate that word. People keep on saying vendors. And we're an ILS vendor, okay? So we don't really, you have to do things right. But look at it as the other types of vendors, okay, here, Elsevier here, ProQuest, and they have completely other different requirements. Don't know how it gets into patrons, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be very different from an iOS vendor.
Libraries are being grouped together.
And I think you could start with a statement on one end of the continuum, that you can counter with a statement on the other end of the continuum, and then we can start looking for the bridging aspects of it. Yes, it'd be great if a patron could conduct library business completely anonymously, unless they don't want to, unless they want to have value added. And then we want to be able to add value if they understand that by adding value, they are giving up their anonymity for the sake of value. And then we suddenly need to be able to do it not anonymously. And you brought up academic institutions, whether they are K-12 schools or universities, those are students who do not live in a separate environment, that they have contracted de facto or de jure with an institution to provide them with educational services to best meet their educational needs. There is information that must be considered. And so, I think it's going to definitely create some fascinating conversation as we look to create principles that attempt to express things, but also have quite a few asterisks and footnotes and, other disclaimers attached to them as well.
I'm thinking that that actually is potentially a pretty productive way of working this, starting with a fairly absolute statement on one side or the other of the issue, and then chipping away at the obvious problems first, and then seeing if it can be sculpted into something that's actually usable. I mean, for example, in terms of the completely anonymous transactions, basically, for operational needs, I don't know of any library system that could function in that way. I mean, certainly no circulation system can function without knowing who the borrower is. All of our electronic resource access is authenticated by an IP address, which is what confirms that the person is part of an institution that has a subscription. And there has to be a mechanism to validate the user. Even if they're going through easy proxy, then the easy proxy log will indicate who that individual is. That's necessary for dealing with cases of malicious use, abuse, et cetera. So, right on the surface, you can see some things that won't work as a result of that, but then, you get into grayer areas beyond that. Okay, you've kept that data for a while. How long do you need to keep it? At some point, should it be anonymized, whatever.
I would argue that checking out a book, which generally you're not anonymous at that point, that's a matter of convenience. You can read the book in the library anonymously, or relatively so if there's not web cameras. And the same is true with electronic resources. You can usually get access on a network where it would be relatively, and in the library I work in, you can get on our network anonymously inside the library and access the e-resources. So it's a matter of convenience for you to have remote access off campus. So I'm not disagreeing overall with what you're saying, but I do think there is a model, and it's the model of once again, the trade-off of convenience against anonymity.
So, actually, trying to think of ways in which we might extract some of these ideas and might it be a useful exercise to kind of go collectively, extract out, some principles that you all think, extreme or not, that we can put forward and then discuss?
Might I suggest maybe we start with this one that we have on the table, and using Google Docs or the old-fashioned paper, put
right.
a proposition. All library transactions should be as anonymous as possible. And then what are the situations in which they may not be? Scroll to the principal section.
So, up.
It's indexed top of page 2-ish.
Top of page 2-ish. Principles.
So I'm going to go back to a comment made on the last virtual session, and also pick up something earlier, which is what from the previous sessions, there were a number of principles, a number of guidelines articulated were most useful to people. In the previous session, I made maybe the provocative statement that we have enough principles. And maybe this comes from now 4 years doing research, at the sort of principle level, and also from the understanding that we are attempting to get to something that is actionable, and that institutions like a library, like different sorts of libraries or service providers, could make a credible commitment to this. So I'm wondering whether it's possible to design the principles as sort of example, maybe principles of applications of more general principles within the library environment. So if you say, if one of the principles that we agree on generally is transparency, which also comes, which we don't have to invent because it's in pretty much every principle document in this area, then can we say what some of the boundaries of that are within the library setting? Can we do that for things like accountability, for use limitation, for openness, for individual participation, and for security safeguards, for some of the existing frameworks from either FIP or OECD or privacy by design or Helen Nissenbaum's contextual. We agree, privacy, information should be collected in context, and what you should do with it is relevant to the context. That's good, but without specifying what that means in the library environment, you don't know what you're committing to. So can we take some of those that are out there and now map it to a library environment? So a friendly amendment to what you said. I don't know if, I was going through the OECD principles because they're stated at a higher level, but FIP might be a good place to start.
No, I call them the best, but OECD was the more full implementation, so OECD is great.
I agree. I think that's useful.
I think we should be able to come up with some things that everyone in the room agrees with, rather than starting with, one case where we have two extremes. And there are a lot of people starting to talk, and I think maybe it's a good time to break up into groups and to try to come up with some things that we think the entire room should agree with. Transparency is good, but how do you balance it off against other things? And we need some guiding principles to guide us in developing, when is transparency important, when do we need to keep data, things like that. And I feel like we need to have some more agreement in the room before we start going down and talking about particular cases.
Okay. Why don't we then do that? Maybe if I could pull up one of the FIPS or OECD or something along those lines, put it up on the screen, and then go through, think about, as Eric said, what can we agree on, like big picture, transparency, choice, data sharing, as general themes to start the conversation. How does that sound as a reasonable first step? And then go through each of those four sessions, themes, perspectives, with those general topics that we've all agreed are generally important. And what are the implications of those? 5 or 6 concepts. All right, so why don't we do this? We'll take a break on the stream for a minute. Why don't we reorganize ourselves? I think maybe this group and this group could merge, and then we're. Huh? Yeah, kind of